Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming back. It's a beautiful day, and we're very appreciative of the fact that you are here to join us again after lunch. I am Shihoko Goto with the Wilson Center's Asia program, and I would like to express my gratitude as a staff member of the Wilson Center for SMU to allow us to host this event. We spent the morning talking about security challenges facing the United States and Japan. But this afternoon, we will be talking about perhaps a bigger challenge, and that is the challenge in the economic sphere, and especially in trade relations. Now, putting this in perspective, Japan stepped up to the role of promoting free and fair trade after the United States left the TPP in January 2017. It has really not given up the hope that the United States might rejoin the TPP, now renamed the CPTPP, eventually down the line. If not under this administration, then perhaps the next one. It also continues to say that this is not a containment policy, and it would truly welcome China to also join the CPTPP down the line. Since January 2017, we perhaps also have a clearer idea of what the U.S. trade strategy may be. It is clearly not amenable to multilateral trade agreements. It takes on a much more unilateral approach to trade. It has a focus on deficits and reducing America's deficits against countries, especially in the area of goods. And it has not hesitated from taking action in the form of tariffs on both, for both political as well as economic gain, both against rival countries as well as long-established allied countries as well. Now, whether this strategy will pay off for the United States remains to be seen. But perhaps the bigger question that we would like to raise today is, are we actually asking the right questions when it comes to defining national trade objectives? Do the trade rules that we're negotiating at the moment actually meet the needs of the 21st century's economic needs? Should we be focusing more on other issues, especially in reducing non-tariff barriers, especially in services, including digital trade or cross-border data sharing? Looking ahead, we would like to focus on this panel about what Japan can do to improve and exercise a greater role in ensuring a global economic order, and to that extent, within that also a greater adherence to the international liberal order. But can it do so? Does it have the political will? Does it have the economic capital? What happens if and when a bilateral U.S.-Japan trade agreement is reached? And are certain sectors more vulnerable to a bilateral U.S.-Japan agreement than others? We will be looking today at the auto industry in particular, and we will also be talking about the spillover effect of the ongoing China-U.S. trade tensions as well. There is certainly no lack of issues for us to discuss, and I'm really very much excited to be able to introduce a stellar panel of speakers today. You have their full bios in front of you, but I would like to introduce them briefly in the order they will be speaking. The center is Mireia Solis, who is the director of the Center for East Asia Policy Studies and Philip Knight Chair in Japan Studies, as well as a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. She is also the author of Dilemmas of a Trading Nation, Japan and the United States in the Evolving Asia-Pacific Order, that came out about 2 years ago. And in 2018, that book received the Masayoshi Ohira Memorial Award. She will be followed by Taeko Hoshino, who flew in yesterday to join us from Tokyo. She is a fellow emeritus of the Institute of Developing Economies Japan External Trade Organization. She has spent a number of years in Mexico as a visiting researcher of El Colegio de Mexico, and has done field work on Mexican business groups, especially the Mexican auto industry. And then finally, the only man on our panel is I would like to really introduce him as my friend as much as a colleague, Hiroki Takeuchi, who is the Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Sun and Star Program. His focus is really on Chinese and Japanese politics, comparative political economy of authoritarian regimes, and he's also the author of Tax Reform in Rural China, Revenue Resistance, and Authoritarian Rule. So, with that, Maria.
Thank you very much, Shihoko and Hiroki, for the invitation to be here. It is a pleasure, and it's a pleasure also to meet Professor Hoshino. I just found out that she was a visiting fellow in my alma mater in Mexico City, El Colegio de Mexico. So it's a small world, and it's a pleasure to be here, and particularly so because I was very attracted to the topic that the organizers selected, thinking about Japan, Mexico, United States relations. I think that this triangular relationship does not get the attention it deserves, and there's actually a lot of substance once we begin to dig in, and I hope to do so in my brief remarks. So I'm going to stay within the 10-minute mark, and therefore I would like to focus on two main issues. One is I would like to first do a little bit of looking back and to highlight for all of you how important Mexico, the old NAFTA, have been for Japan's trade policy and also the new U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. I don't think it's widely understood that Mexico was there very much encouraging, motivating Japan to make this shift, important shift towards preferential trade agreements, and then the shadow that has had, the influence that has had over Japan's trade policy over the years. And then, of course, I could not comment on the recently started bilateral negotiations between Japan and the United States and talk about prospects, challenges, and what to look for after the bilateral negotiations. So I'll try to keep it in within the amount of time allocated. So let me then talk about Mexico, the old NAFTA, and the new NAFTA, and how that has impacted in, I think, very profound ways the way in which Japan has developed its own trade policy. Let me start by making the point that the original NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Agreement, was really a wake-up call among the Japanese business community and trade policy circles on the risks that Japan faced if it did not emulate what was becoming a dominant trend in the international trading system and begin to negotiate preferential trade agreements. You may recall that for most of the post-war period, Japan was an advocate of multilateralism only. And there was this view that if Japan were to begin to negotiate preferential trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements, that this could weaken the multilateral trading system and therefore an aversion to do so. But the world was changing, and I think that many countries were responding to the stagnation in the negotiation at the WTO and GATT before that, and began to then develop their own preferential trade agreements, and Japan began to feel the pressure because it was feeling that it could actually be quite marginalized if other countries were not doing this. And talking to Japanese trade officials at the time, they would frequently make the remark that there were only 4 or 5 countries in the world that did not have yet a preferential trade agreement, and Japan was one of them. So there was this sense of isolation. There was a sense of not having the same a range of policy tools that other countries had, and therefore that Japan had to innovate. But Mexico in particular had a very important role in the birth of Japan's FTA policy, or free trade agreement policy. As I'm preparing for this panel, I was digging back some of my old documents, and I found an article published by Hatakeyama Noburo, who was chairman of JETRO and also vice minister of MITI, and he was talking about how Japan became interested in free trade agreements, and he recalls a lunch that he had with Mexico's trade minister, Herminio Blanco, who proposed the idea of a bilateral trade agreement. This was in the summer of 1998, and that led Japan to actually launch a task force in MITI, thinking about what would it take for Japan to develop an entirely different track to its trade policy and begin to develop preferential trading relations. And this then paved the way for eventually what would become a major shift in Japan's trade policy. After this launch, it was decided that both governments would commission feasibility studies on the possibility of a Japan-Mexico trade agreement. This was exactly 20 years ago. And I was very fortunate because I was the person in Mexico that did the government for the Mexican trade minister on the potential for this trade agreement. There were other studies later on, but this was the first. In that way, this began to really sink in Japanese policy circles, the need for Japan to then shift towards bilateral trade agreements. But we are not in the clear. Anybody who has followed Japan's trade policy knows how difficult it has been for Japan to become more proactive, more ambitious in the negotiation table. And this was the beginning of the policy, so there was a lot of resistance, especially from the agricultural sector. So I remember very vividly that the outlook was not very good when I completed the study. We had, Jetro was our counterpart, by the way, and we had a video conference where we would be sharing our findings. And we were pretty much floored on the Mexican side when we heard from the Japanese side that because of resistance in Japan, agriculture had to be completely excluded from the trade negotiations. And that was a non-starter for us. It would mean that the agreement could not fly with WTO rules, and therefore things were not looking pretty. But just again to highlight how Mexico had a lot to do with how Japan decided to flesh out its trade policy, later on in Japanese trade circles, it became a point of discussion, the fact that in the Mexico-EU trade agreement, there had been significant exclusions on important agricultural commodities, not an entirely outright exclusion of the agricultural sector, but that nevertheless that made the agreement possible. And I remember talking to people in agricultural circles in Japan in the early 2000s, thinking that that was a very good precedent to give political traction to an FTA policy in Japan, that you can think about excluding the most sensitive commodities without having to protect the entire sector, and maybe this would make the agreement more doable. My last point is that when Japan and Mexico actually sat and negotiated the trade agreement, there was a lot of precedents that were created for Japan in that negotiation. This was the first time that Japan agreed to give agricultural concessions outside the WTO. They were minor, they were modest, but again, consider what the resistance was. It was important. But also it was the first time that Japan negotiated for example, a negative list for services and many other things that were necessary for the trade agreement. And I remember again talking to the Mexican trade negotiators. By that time, Mexico had negotiated with scores of countries trade agreements. And the one thing that I always remark is that it was never, negotiating with Japan was completely different. And they said there's no break. And there's no break because our Japanese counterparts are constantly calling on us, asking us about how we negotiate this, how we negotiate that, because it was the first time that Japan had negotiated really a preferential trade agreement with a country that was a large agricultural exporter. So I like to refer to this in a positive way as on-the-job training. And this is a very important development for how Japan then took on the subsequent negotiation of trade agreements. It's true that the first trade agreement that Japan negotiated was with Singapore, but keep in mind that Singapore does not export agricultural items, and it's a duty-free economy. And therefore, the negotiation with Mexico, I'd make the case, was the first real substantive negotiation that allowed Japanese trade policy to not have an end of one when negotiating preferential trade agreements. So then this brings us to the new NAFTA and why it's important to Japan. It's important because there's been, as a result of the original NAFTA, a result of the Japan-Mexico trade agreement, there's been a very significant inflow of Japanese investment, especially in the automobile sector. So Japanese companies have been operating along this integrated North American production platform, and therefore the continuation of NAFTA in its new version, the U.S.-Mexico trade agreement, is really important for Japanese companies and especially some sectors like the automobile sector. But I would make the case that there's a broader importance on the USMCA, not just its impact on specific economic sectors, but also because just like with the original NAFTA, that it was sending a signal to Japan that the world had changed, that the international trade politics have shifted, that Japan needed to innovate with preferential trade agreements. With the new NAFTA, what Japan is doing is trying to cope with a new direction in international trade politics that we are now witnessing unfold before our own eyes. So, uncertainty has become the word that we always use, because obviously we don't know what the president is going to do. We just got a surprise a couple of days ago. So we just don't know. But if you were to ask me, what are the parameters of America First trade policy? Where should we look for some guidance? I would say go look at the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. Because in terms of template, that is what this administration wants to propose as how it would reshape, remake, or negotiate a new trade agreements. So in that sense, the USMCA is very important for Japan. So much so that many of the demands and objectives that the Americans put in the USMCA, and many of them, of course, they achieved, have then migrated to the list of objectives that the USTR set up in terms of negotiation with Japan. So there's a clear connection, and therefore Japan can learn a lot about what happened in the USMCA to think about how you strategize negotiations now with the United States. Some of these objectives that are important now for the negotiation with Japan, but were part of the USMCA, are of course the focus, as Shihoko mentioned, on reducing the bilateral trade deficit, the idea that now there is a currency manipulation clause with some enforceable elements in the body of the text. This is different from the original TPP. The language, which again was a big surprise to all of us, on the non-market free trade agreement, and that creates some concerns as to how this might affect negotiations with China going forward, and I can elaborate later on that. And of course, the decision of Canada and Mexico to sign side letters, thereby agreeing to some kind of voluntary export restraint in the automobile sector. These are all problematic areas, I should say, for Japan when it comes to negotiating now with the United States, and they're now in the template of the USMCA, and they have then been moved on to the bilateral talks. So let me then just say a few words on the prospects, challenges, and opportunities, because I don't want to be just on the pessimistic side, but also opportunities for the U.S.-Japan bilateral economic relationship in terms of this trade negotiation. First is that we should not expect, as easy and comfortable it would be, that the bilateral talks would be a replay of the TPP dynamics. The world has changed, and these two countries have moved on. So the negotiation dynamics, I think, are going to be completely different. It may seem now like ancient history, but in fact, it was just a few years ago when the United States was advocating the negotiation of trans-Pacific and transatlantic trade agreements with multiple countries. And it was also not so long ago, 6 years ago, when it looked like Japan may actually miss the boat. That Japan, because of its own domestic sensitivities and the lack of political resolve, would not be able to come on board the TPP, and therefore would miss that chance. Well, look where we are at today, and this again goes back to what Shihoko was mentioning in her opening remarks. We know that the United States is not interested anymore on these trans-Pacific, transatlantic, large-scale, multi-party trade agreements. The word now is bilateral. That's what the United States is now pursuing, because it feels that it has more advantages with a one-on-one deal. I have strong reservations on the merits of such an approach, but that is what the approach is. There's also now an approach or a decision to use the tariff as a main source to protect specific economic sectors like the steel industry, the aluminum industry, but also to gain leverage in trade negotiations. So clearly then the United States has a very different approach and has very different tactics when it comes to trade negotiations. And Japan, on the other hand, is the one country that did finish that, that did cross that finish line that the United States had in the beginning. It is Japan that has now in hand the TPP-11. It is Japan now the one that has in hand a trade agreement with the European Union. And those two trade agreements are now in force, and they have now created a lot of pressure on American producers who are really facing the possibility of marginalization in the Japanese market. The figures from the past few months have been very eloquent in the sense that Australian beef, for example, is now really expanding its market share, and that American producers may be paying as much as, maybe twice as much as Australian producers if a safeguard tariff does go into place. Now, then we know then that the situation is very different, and we know that there are disagreements. These disagreements were evident in the joint statement of President Trump and Prime Minister Abe when it comes to identifying what is the main objective. President Trump said reducing bilateral trade deficits. Prime Minister Abe said rules-based trade. The differences are also evident in the acronyms that each side uses to describe the negotiation exercise. For the United States, the acronym continues to be a full-blown free trade agreement. For Japan, they innovated with a new term, trade agreement in goods. It's not a battle of acronyms, but what is underneath it. And that means that there is a difference in the sense of ambition, scope, and sequencing of these negotiations that has not been completely ironed out. But I would make that the most important difference is when you think about what is the most urgent objective that is bringing both countries to the negotiation table, is something that was completely out of the picture when the original TPP negotiations took place. Let me describe it in these ways. For the United States, for Japan, it's about deflecting U.S. unilateralism. For the United States, it's catching up with Japan's trade leadership. So let me elaborate on that. What I mean is that Prime Minister Abe, after demurring, decided to agree to the bilateral trade talks precisely because it faces the risk of a unilateral move of the United States in increasing tariffs on automobiles, using a very dubious, weak argument that automobile imports hinder U.S. national security. So that's what brings Japan to the table. It's a completely different motivation than what brought Japan to the TPP table. And on the U.S. side, well, I think that, quite frankly, they thought that the TPP without the United States had no future. And may I remind you that 2 years ago, that was a common wisdom in most events here in D.C. and everywhere. Because nobody thought that other countries could move on with the United States, and nobody thought that Japan could provide the leadership to recalibrate the TPP and make it fly. So now it happens, it becomes clear that other countries can move on and American producers are disadvantaged. And that's, I think, what the president is precisely focused on. Now, I know that I've gone very long, just a couple of comments. I would say that there is a risk that the Trump administration may mismanage the trade negotiations with Japan. Some of the potential risks that I see is if the United States frames these as one-sided concessions where Japan has to just magically open the agricultural market without expecting to receive something in return. Trade negotiations are always both ways. They have to be win-win to be politically viable. Another potential pitfall is if the United States were to try to revert back to manage trade tactics and demand of Japan an export restraint on automobiles. That again would violate WTO rules, and I would hope that Japan, as I decided, has graduated from that and is now in a position of leader of free trade agreements. It cannot agree to something that so openly goes against the spirit of free trade. And of course, the other pitfall is if the president makes good on his threat of raising the tariffs to 25%. But let me end with a positive note. It doesn't have to go that way. I think that there is a possibility for a grand bargain if especially the Americans want to take it. And that would mean that there would be an agreement from Japan to give TPP-level agricultural concessions in exchange for the United States to putting aside any trade-reducing demand. By this I mean quotas, by this I mean tariffs. And I think that later you can flesh out the details, but that has to be at the core of that bilateral understanding. And I think that this is an agreement that can gain traction politically in both countries. It's an agreement that maintains whole the WTO rulebook, and it's an agreement, most importantly as well, that would allow Japan and the United States to not make, again, trade an issue of disagreement, but get past these market access talks and think about, as Shihoko was saying, where the real game is taking place in Asia. And that is about codifying rules on digital economy. It's about pooling resources on infrastructure finance. There are many things that can be done, reform of the WTO. So I think that we're facing a critical question, and that is, do we agree to have a disagreement among strong allies over these market access issues, or we think about how we leverage the alliance in the most strategic and consequential ways? I stop here.
Thank you, Mireya, for that very comprehensive view. And for that dose of optimism as well. if we could have Professor Hoshino's presentation.
Should I move?
If you can move slightly.
Hoshino-san, you want to sit here? No.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to Takeuchi Sensei and all the organizer for inviting me to this symposium as presentator. I consider that in the actual economic relation of U.S., Japan, Mexico, the most disputed issue is how to treat with the automobile industry in trades among three countries, so that today I focus this industry as a subject of my presentation, especially on my concern about the disruption of the North American supply chain of automobile industry. I can't speak fluently English, so that to divert the attention of audience, I prepared PowerPoint. So my presentation is divided in three parts. Yes. Firstly, I briefly sketch the global value chain of automobile industry. Secondly, I explain the making process of the North American supply chain and the role of FTA in its making process. Thirdly, I speak on my concern weakening of North American production system of automobile by protectionism. Finally, I conclude my presentation by trying to answer the question presented in the title. The North American production system of automobile is in danger. So, as I have already said, automobile industry is main disputed issue of economic relation of U.S., Japan, Mexico, despite is mainly on the amount of trade value or deficit or surplus of trade balance among countries. But I have a doubt that the trade value rightly reflect the gains accrued to countries. If traded goods are produced in one country, as in the early 20th century, when the globalization rapidly proceeded, we could say yes. But in the actual globalization, traded goods have very complicated background. Final products of manufacturing industry contains parts produced in other countries or have crossed borders several times. It is difficult to capture who and which country gain or have gain from trade by only seeing the value of trade. In the actual globalization, it is important to see how the production systems are organized, which firm control the system, and which country is involved in the system. I will focus on the global value chain of automobile industry. The global value chain of automobile industry has following four characteristics: nested structure of local, national, regional, global chain. Second, three regional production systems exist. Same players in each regional production systems and pyramidal organization of supply chain. I will explain by figure. In the figure, I indicated 13 largest vehicle production countries. According to the study of Sturgeon and Gerafi and others, world automobile industry has nested structure of 4 layers. Global value chain is the first layer. Inside the first layer, 3 regional production systems or second layer are developed. Almost all the largest producing countries are located within the regional production system. Within each country's national production system, or the third layer, is developed. And within the national production system, local cluster or fourth layer, which is not indicated in the figure, are developed. Regional production systems are developed in East Asia, West Europe, and North America. They are shown dotted circles. Countries within the regional production system are connected by intertwined supply chains. Dotted circle is a principal unit of production system. Between regions, vehicles and auto parts are traded in order to complement products. Although regional production systems are evolved in different parts of the globe, principal players of the system are same multinational assemblers and same multinational auto parts producers. Competition are fierce, not only among players within regions, but also between regions. Assemblers and auto part producers are connected by forming stratified pyramidal organization of supply chain. NAFTA and Japan-Mexico Economic Partnership Agreement contributed in making the supply chain of North American production system. Let me show its making process. The North American production system has developed in the past 30 years. Its making process is divided in three stages. The first stage began in the middle of 1980s when government of Mexico changed its development policy on a neoliberal one due to the external debt crisis. It was a time when the competition among assemblers became fierce in the U.S. market due to the advance of Japanese assemblers. Coincident needs of restructuring of national production system, both in Mexico and in the United States, led to the formation of regional production system. The second stage began in 1994 when NAFTA started. NAFTA played a role of institutional backing of transition from national system to regional system, which had already started. And Japan-Mexico EPA of 2005 improved the condition of for Japanese firms to join in the regional production system. The third stage began after the collapse of Lehman Brothers. By the financial crisis that followed, competitions among firms became fiercer, and firms restructured their production in Mexico and production system, and in its process, investment to Mexico expanded. A part of new players in Mexico were U.S. firms which came to the north of the border in order to improve their competitiveness. Another important part were Japanese firms, which were forced to find overseas production sites due to the appreciation of Japanese yen. Development of North American production system is reflected in the accelerated growth of automobile industry in Mexico. And this graph is divided for the national internal market and exports. So exports expanded very rapid pace, especially after the 2010, the third stage. So that getting position in the North American production system, Mexico became one of the major automobile producing and exporting country in the world. Now actually 7th producing countries of the world. Now I focus on the part of US and Mexico of the North American production system, excluding Canada, because the subject of my presentation is US, United States, and Mexico and Japan. Japanese firms are important players in the region. An important characteristic of North American production system is a division of labor among three countries. According to competitive advantage of each country's products and production system process are allocated to member countries. The US and Canada specialize in large size and high price vehicles and capital intensive process. And competitive advantage of Mexico is low labor cost, so that Mexico specializes in assembly of compact-sized vehicle of low price zone and labor-intensive process of output production. It is natural consequence of making process because given the initial condition of liberalization of trade and investment and fierce competition in the market, and the exploitation of competitive advantage was a driving force of making of North American production system. And NAFTA and Japan-Mexico EPA were also implemented, premising on these conditions. Figure shows the division of Figure shows the division of labor between U.S. and Mexico. Until 1982, two national production systems, or the United States and Mexico, were divided by the border, but actually the border was disappeared. Products and production systems are allocated according to the competitive advantages of each country, but now this division of labor faces a threat of protectionism. And by the rise of protectionism, conditions for functioning of North American production system seems to be running out. Although the situation is still fluid, it is possible to think about probable scenarios of consequence of protectionism. The worst scenario would be the restoration of tariff. It would cause the disruption of supply chain and weakening of the regional production system. Although it is difficult to predict the future, what is clear is that due to the huge cost of transition and the loss of competitive advantage formerly enjoyed, production cost will increase, and therefore North American system will lose competitiveness to other two regions. Another scenario is the via from NAFTA to USMCA would also cause following problems. Problems which should not be overlooked is a loss of confidence on policies and institutions. The via from NAFTA to USMCA shows that they can easily change by political consideration of short term. Its announcement effect can damage the confidence on policy and institution of those involved in the event, which may spoil attractiveness of North America as a destiny of investment of production site, which need to be planned in a long time horizon. The via from NAFTA to USMCA will also cause a loss of competitive advantage of North American automobile industry. USMCA is disadvantageous for Mexico in the way that it put quota on export of vehicles from Mexico to US and induce investment to US by raising local content requirement and by requiring a certain level of salary for production sites of certain kind of outputs. After the financial crisis, US farmers rushed to the south of border. Now, USMCA will change the move toward the north. If compact vehicles were assembled in the US and labor-intensive processes of outputs production were carried out in the US, the price of products would rise, which will spoil the competitiveness of vehicle and outputs made in North America. These actual worrisome situation cause another problem for firms who must treat with the emergence of CASE. CASE is an abbreviation of Connected Autonomous Sharing Electric Vehicle. Production system and characteristic of products of CASE vehicles are totally different from those of gasoline engine vehicles. Firms of automobile industry is now in the world are now seeking the best mix of investment between two types of vehicles. Inducement of investment to gasoline engine vehicle by taking U.S. market as pledge will make difficult a rational judgment of farmers and spoil their competitiveness, and also distort restructuring of North American automobile industry. So my conclusion. Now I conclude my presentation. Is the North American production system of automobile in danger? The answer is yes. It is danger because of protectionism. So, what kind of danger? Firstly, protectionism will make difficult for the players in the system to enjoy the competitive advantage of member countries. Second rate, protectionism will oblige players in the system additional cost of adaptation. These problems weaken the competitiveness of players and competitiveness of North America to East Asia and West Europe as a production system. Finally, who will pay the cost of transition? I suppose cost of protectionism will pass to U.S. consumers and also workers in Mexico. I hope my pessimistic scenario will not be fulfilled. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Moshino-san. I think that last slide in particular was very helpful for us. And of course, the automobile sector faces many challenges, not just on trade, but also on technological advances and social change as well. It's Hiroki's turn. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming.
Microphone on?
Speaking from that is not so convenient.
Is that on?
This is okay. Thank you very much for coming for this symposium. As an organizer, I'm very glad to see you come to this session, but I'm particularly glad to see Mr. Shin Takahashi of NEC, who was in Dallas for a long time as a business leader of DFW, and I'm glad to say that he is a recipient of last year's Japan Metal Society Sun Star Legacy Award. So I'm very pleased with seeing you. When I was organizing this symposium, I was thinking about two panels, and then one on security, the other on economy. And the original title of this panel was U.S. Japan Economic Relations. And then in January, I was invited to a Japan Society Washington, D.C. Symposium. And then we were talking about Japan in 2019. I was wondering something is missing in the discussion. And I realized that then actually nobody talks about Mexico. And that's actually very weird for somebody who is in Texas. In Texas, if you discuss any issue, well, you have to talk about Mexico. So Texas and Mexico, our economy are integrated. And it's very easy to make a consensus about how the integrated economy between Mexico and the US would be good for the US economy in Texas. So we have a word called Texco. That's actually the word like our sister institute in SMU Mission Foods, Texas-Mexico Relations Center, always talks about the concept on the implication of Texco. So that's why I included the Mexico in the mix of the economic relations. And I'm pleased with inviting two best people who I can think of to talk about U.S.-Japan Mexico economic relations. I myself am an expert of China, And that's actually how I started my career as a scholar. And then now working with Mansfield Foundation and Japan Foundation, I have had an opportunity to work on U.S. Japan relations. And then at the U.S. Japan relations, people are always talking about China. So that was actually, I found it interesting. And today I had a warning from Shihoko that maybe a lot of questions about U.S.-China trade war, although today we are talking about U.S.-Japan relations. So, so I go from the question, the title of my today's presentation is from the title of this symposium. So international trade order in disarray. And then I would say, well, although as in the morning I said there was a protest against the argument that the U.S.-Japan relations in disarray, and then probably U.S.-Japan relations are not in disarray, but the international trade order is in disarray, I would say. And then, so question is, so who will lead the new rulemaking? And rulemaking is really needed, and because of the spread of the global value chains. And so the trade is very different now. So the usually the whole one for producing some product, the parts are going back and forth across the borders. And then the one product is completed. So a lot of trade is nowadays, especially in the Asia Pacific, is so-called intra-industry trade, where the parts are traded to produce a product. And actually, TPP was a new rulemaking of such a new trend of international trade. So nowadays, trade agreements include a lot of rules of domestic regulations, which is directly related to domestic politics. So it's not just tariffs. So tariffs among the developed countries are very low. Well, tariffs in the developing countries tend to be still high. But we have to make rules of the investment, electronic commerce, government procurement, property rights, intellectual property rights. And even this is actually the list of the agreement of the CPTPP, and even it includes anti-corruption. Now, usually you think corruption is a totally a domestic political issue, right? But it's now in the part of the stipulation of the free trade agreements. And another trend, another reality in the world right now is the WTO, World Trade Organization, is not working as a rule-making organization anymore for various reasons. And one of the major reasons is a lot of countries are there, not just the developed countries anymore. Developing countries are major members of the WTO. It's much more difficult to make an agreement among the member countries of the WTO. And that's why Doha Round basically collapsed. So WTO is not working. So as a rule-making organization, but somebody has to make the rules. So mega FTAs, so the big FTAs are the venues for the rule-making. And FTAs, the strength of FTA is it's a smaller number of the countries. So as a result, it's easier to agree. But the negative aspect of FTA is it's a smaller number of the members, which means the rules will not spread. So that's why mega FTA is a good balance. And these are the attempt of the mega FTAs, NAFTA or USMCA. That is actually a mega FTA, although 3 countries, but the countries are big, so it's a big one. And then CPTPP. And the Japan-EU EPA is a very ambitious attempt. And then RCEP. And then today I'm going to talk about mainly the CPTPP. And then also I talk a little bit about RCEP. But point here is the major difference between CPTPP and RCEP is the CPTPP is really talking about domestic regulation that is really needed for rulemaking of global value chains-based international trade. But RCEP, you cannot talk, it doesn't basically stipulate domestic regulation, and they just basically talk about tariffs. The reason is, again, domestic regulations. And then what does it include? Well, it includes state-owned enterprise, right? And then China is, RCEP is led by China, and China does not want to be committed, or China is not ready to be committed to state-owned enterprise reform. And then that's actually one of the major reasons why RCEP does not include rules over domestic regulations. So why China cannot be committed to the domestic economic reforms like a state-owned enterprise reform? Well, basically, Chinese domestic politics are divided by the two groups over how to be committed, or whether and how to be committed to the reform. And the one is I call the reformism, the other is I call the anti-reformists. And reformist basically says, well, SOE reform, that is needed for sustainable economic growth, right? But at the same time, SOE system has a lot of vested interests. And it's, I would say, collusive and sometimes corrupt. But at the same time, they have a lot of vested interests. So as a result, those who have vested interests resist the reform. So this is actually all the domestic politics. They make a coalition with views on approach to foreign policy. So internationalists who appreciate international cooperation, they argue that a peaceful and cooperative international environment is really needed for China to enjoy the involvement in the global economy. However, from the anti-reformist perspective, well, involvement in the FTA that stipulates domestic economic reform, that is kind of suicidal. So they make a coalition with nationalists, and then they do not mind projecting power, and then they don't. They even pursue the policy of the abrasive policy in international politics. Japan. So interesting thing is that Japan has how Japanese domestic politics responds to the trade policy. And then today, actually, I'm actually a little bit nervous because I'm presenting in front of Mireya, who wrote an excellent book I learned a lot from about Japanese domestic politics and the trade policy. But so this is actually trying to relate this to this morning's discussion. So there is two dimensions of the policies, and then like the view on free trade, view on trade policy versus the view on the military roles. And what Abe did was trying to make a coalition of the in the Japanese domestic politics for more military roles. And so you can see, and then in terms of right and left balance, basically the moderates are for free trade. And then at both sides of the right and left basically argue against free trade. But point here is that this morning there is a discussion about why that Japan does not rise populism. One situation that Japan has, but then other countries do not, is actually moderate is now strengthened. And then that's why I think that Abe still can push TPP, CPTPP, and for free trade policy. United States has this problem, similar power balance in the domestic politics. But in the United States, we are talking about divisive politics, right? So middle is moderate are now weaker. And that's the reason why support for free trade is weakened. And then, so in terms of right and left, actually the divisive politics, both ends of the right and left are strengthened. And then that's why protectionism has been rising. And then the reason, one of the reasons why the moderate gets weaker, and then populism is strengthened, is the people. So the point, those who lost the social safety net, they start argue against trade. So if like some people lost a job, and then they found that they also lost social safety net, and then they tend to blame trade. Although there is, I think economist consensus that actually trade is that most of the job losses in the United States is not because of trade, but because of automation. But whatever the reason it is, actually those who lost the social safety net tends to blame trade. So that's why the moderate is that really like weakened. So very briefly, talking about later, like we can talk about this in the Q&A. But U.S.China Trade War, that's a big issue. And this is something that I'm afraid of, which means U.S. demands to China. Well, I would say that the U.S. demands to China is actually the right demand. So intellectual property rights, forced technology transfer, investment restrictions, and then also Made in China 2025. That is actually the retreat from the SOE reform. But problem of the Trump administration is very much obsessed with the trade deficit, and therefore they may make a deal if they do. They may make a deal with increases, China's increases in U.S. agriculture and energy exports. But even if U.S. increased the import of soybeans, even if China increases imports of the soybeans from the United States, it doesn't solve any of the problem of the intellectual property rights or forced technology transfer or stagnation of SOE reform. But actually, look at what the CPTPP stipulates. And then most of the domestic regulations, these stipulations may respond to what the US is demanding to China. So the right approach, I would say, is really like pushing the CPTPP to China. And then they may not be ready, and they are not ready, I think. But they will try to keep giving the pressure to China. So kind of like the Japanese say gaiatsu. And then we should wait for China's response and give China an incentive, and then strengthening the reformist internationalists. And then so that's actually the idea I would argue that then we should take. Well, of course, assumption is we should, United States should go back to the TPP. So who will lead international trade order? Two conditions are needed to lead international trade order now. Number one, the country has to have a healthy social welfare policy. Otherwise, people start blaming trade, even if their challenge, their suffering is not because of trade. The secondly, now more and more FTAs are talking about domestic regulations. So those countries that are committed to domestic economic reform, like a regulatory reform, that is the condition for the country to lead international trade order. And then third, those international trade, those countries that lead international trade order will lead trade order rulemaking through mega FTAs because WTO is not functioning. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiroki. That was, you covered a lot of ground, and I know we have a lot of questions. Let me just open it up. If you do have questions, there are microphones. No? Okay. Well, let me go to Maria. You said you would come back to it. It was about the poison pill clause in USMCA about dealing with non-market economies. Can you expound a little bit about some of the challenges this would pose as Japan tries to move forward with on a bilateral deal with the United States?
Sure, Shihoko, happy to. So this was, as I said, a surprise. We didn't know that the language was going to be included. And I would say that trade scholars that I talked to are divided on whether it is a serious issue or we're making much ado about nothing. I follow on the former category. I think it's not good news. I think it's a negative development. Those who think, well, it's not a big deal because in the current NAFTA, all three governments have the ability to withdraw from the agreement. They just need to give 6 months notice and then they can be out. So then this clause per se does not change the ability that these governments, the discretion these governments have to leave. But I think that there is requirements that are now built in the clause, but more importantly, it's about the messaging. And this falls within the larger context of economic friction with China on many, many different fronts. So first off, I would say what this clause establishes is that if countries were to decide to negotiate a new trade agreement with a non-market economy, they now have the obligation to notify the other NAFTA parties, and they must provide the full body of the text before signing the agreement. So that had never been in any other trade agreement. You would never have to notify and provide to a third party your negotiated text. And then there's also the message that negotiating a new trade agreement with a non-market economy can be grounds to be dropped from the existing NAFTA or USMCA and make this a bilateral trade agreement. So there's a very important difference here, because what I described before is a country may decide to leave NAFTA. But here what you're saying is if you choose to negotiate with a non-market economy, and I guess everybody knows who we're referring to, mostly China, then that may bring serious consequences because you may be dropped out of the deal. How this would play out in real terms, in reality, nobody knows because we never had a clause like this. But I do think it's an important messaging device to try to discourage countries to negotiate new trade agreements with China. This applies to countries like Japan, who are negotiating the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, who have a trilateral with Japan and South Korea that's going nowhere. But nevertheless, given that they don't yet have that trade agreement, this could potentially come to limit their options. And I think it actually can backfire for the United States, because if you read that text, if it's in your in the USTR trade negotiation objectives, I think that this is an incentive for Japan and the other countries to wrap up RCEP as fast as possible so that it's a non-issue, which is apparently what the US would not like to see happen, more trade agreements with China.
Okay. All right. Yes. I see a brave hand.
Stanley Kober. About a week ago, there was a meeting in Fiji, the 19th Trilateral Finance Ministers Central Bank Governors meeting. At that meeting, there was a side meeting of the finance ministers and central bank governors of China, Korea, and Japan. They issued a statement. We reaffirm our commitment to resisting all forms of protectionism. Whom is that directed against? There is a saying from the American Revolution, if we don't hang together, we'll all hang separately. Is our policy driving, the Trump administration policy, driving Japan now toward China on the issue of protectionism?
Well, the last question is no. So Japan is proposing the idea of how to confront China's protectionism. And then again, my argument here is the source of the China's protectionism is really state-owned enterprise system. So the idea of pushing pressure to China is really encouraging and almost forcing state-owned enterprise reform. And how to do that? Well, giving China an incentive. And then that was the idea of the TPP. And the problem, the current US administration's policy is really empowering those anti-reformists and anti-reformist nationalists in China. So now, like, anti-reformist nationalists are pointing out, this is actually how US is treating us. Therefore, we were right. So we should really protect our vested interests. And then reformists cannot confront those anti-reformist argument. And so in that sense, the current policy of the US policy toward China is self-fulfilling. And if China is united as anti-reformist nationalists, then there is no way for any country, US or Japan, to promote the state-owned enterprise reform. And then if SOE problem, state capitalist problem, is not solved, then it's actually almost no way for China to come back to the global economy as a responsible player.
If I can comment, I think that's a great question. And there are different aspects to it. One is that the United States, I think, has committed a mistake with the current administration. It used to be that it was a standard statement in the G7, in APEC meetings, that at the end of the meeting there would be a communique where all countries would reaffirm their commitment to free trade. That became a testy proposition in the latest meetings. And I think that the United States is therefore vacating a space and creating an easy entry for China, for example, to now try to plant the flag of free trade. The problem is that we know from Hiroki's presentation that China has many, many barriers to foreign trade, that does not give equal access to foreign enterprises, and that is carrying out a very activist industrial policy with heavy industrial subsidies and tons of facilities for state-owned enterprises. So there's a big gap between the rhetoric that China uses and the reality. But the United States gave that easy entry, I think, to China to be making those statements. I also think that if you're going to think about an alignment of minds with real action, then think about the Japan-EU trade agreement. Because again, the statement was from both Abe and the European Commission that this trade agreement now had broader meaning, and that in a context where you see economic nationalism on the rise, protectionism on the rise, it was a reaffirmation of these countries that they still believe in rules-based trade. So, you have to talk the talk and walk the walk, and I think that if you have that standard, then the Japan-EU FTAs goes way beyond that what this trilateral meeting can do.
There is clearly already a spillover effect of the U.S.-China trade friction and the U.S. approach to trade relations writ large. When it comes to Japan and relations with China, the recent rapprochement between Beijing and Tokyo is a direct consequence of concern about the trade stance that Washington has. The challenge for Tokyo will be whether it can decouple a closer economic relationship with China on the one hand and seeing China as its biggest security threat on the other. One thing I do want to point out, though, is that although the Trump administration is adverse to multilateralism and it has been very hostile towards the WTO, as well as other institutions, it has worked together with Japan as well as the EU to push for numerous WTO reform, especially when it comes to dealing with non-market economies without saying it's China, and to talk about some of the structural reform issues that Hiroki outlined, especially when it comes to dealing with subsidies of state-owned enterprises, et cetera. So there is a opportunity as well for the United States to work together with countries, but already the negatives are already very clear. I did see a, yes, sir.
Yes, Dave Fitzgerald, retired Foreign Service. I have a question about the U.S. Japan trade negotiations. I got the impression from Ms. Holz's remarks that you're looking at sort of an early harvest, I think is the term that's used for a kind of early conclusion of the trade agreement between the U.S. and Japan. Is that your prospects, or is that a generally accepted expectation? I've seen some articles that suggest that that's maybe doable. And I was wondering how that might relate to the U.S.-China trade deal, which may or may not be moving towards some conclusion. And depending on how you look at the recent flare-up in possible imposition of 25% tariffs and all that, whether that's just bluff or whatever, is a success on the U.S.-China trade deal going to impact the need for hanging tough by the U.S. administration on a U.S.-Japan trade deal, which presumably would be taking place later in the year? Am I making myself clear on this sort of sequencing of?
Maybe we could also define what success of the U.S.-China deal would
that's
be
a good
as well, and then elaborate a little bit more. Who would like to go first?
Let me comment just on the more narrow point of the early harvest. I don't see much future for that. I think that's in the wish list of the Trump administration because with the many different fronts that they have opened, with the steel tariffs, with the China trade war, with stepping out of the TPP, there has been one group in particular that has taken the hit, and that is American farmers. So there's clear suffering in that sector of the economy, and there's going to be an election next year. So this is something that I think is in the mind of the president, and this explains why, according to some reports, even President Trump wanted to something done by this April. Then he wants something when he visits Japan in late May. That's not going to happen, but that's clearly the American expectation. I don't see how an early harvest on agriculture alone is possible for the following reasons. I would make the case that it would be negotiation malpractice for Japan to agree to this, because it would be like giving the Americans all they want without making sure that what the Japanese need, in the sense of protecting their automobile industry, for example, is not also taken care of. And I was just reading the newspaper, I think that Minister Motegi yesterday or today said something yesterday to the fact that Japan will not agree to wrapping up talks on one sector before everything is ready in terms of the goods part of the negotiation. So I think it's obviously something that the Americans want. It's not something that they're going to get. I also think from the point of view of a trade scholar that it would be problematic if they agreed to an early harvest, because it would be again in contravention, in violation of WTO rules. And then we really are in the slippery slope to everything goes, and all kinds of discriminatory deals that are very easy to negotiate will happen. So what I recently wrote a piece. What I call for is a fast negotiation, but one that has balance to it. And that's why it has to be about the sensitive sectors for Japan and the sensitive sectors for the United States. And I think that Japan has some leverage right now, because I think, as I mentioned before, that the mistake of assuming that the TPP would never fly without the United States is not pretty obvious. And therefore that creates an opportunity that I think can be used to improve the quality of the agreement. Now, how the U.S.-China negotiation factors into this, again, I frequently make the remark to my counterparts in Japan that in many ways they've been lucky in the sense that they were not first in line when the Trump administration decided to experiment with America First trade policy. So it was the Koreans, it was the Mexicans and the Canadians, and it was China. And I think that begins to run the clock for Japan. We're already talking about, well, any trade negotiation finished today, if it's going to be subject to Congress approval, what will happen after the election? That shadow is already there. And I also think that it also has given the Trump administration, believe it or not, some sense of realism. If you think about the demands that started with the NAFTA negotiation, the NAFTA renegotiation, they were completely red lines that would not fly. So, I think that Japan benefits from that. Japan was not eager to start the trade negotiations with the United States. The U.S. has been entirely focused on China, and that has created some space for Japan. But now that the negotiations have started, my point is that it would be good if there's balance to the agreement, to have a quick, clean negotiation, so that this does not disturb broader bilateral relations, which are otherwise very good between the United States and Japan.
Okay. First of all, U.S.-Japan trade negotiation or friction and U.S.-China trade friction or war are very different in nature. And one interesting comparison of a U.S.-Japan trade negotiation is comparing it with U.S.-South Korea trade negotiation or renegotiation of U.S.-Korea FTA. And so basically, South Korea had to compromise with the United States, And when I talked about this with the South Korea expert of the United States, and then he said, well, it's an awful deal, economically. But you know, South Korea had to kind of compromise or with the United States. So I asked him, so are you concerned with the same thing may happen to Japan? His answer was no, and I agree with him. The reason is Japan has CPTPP and Japan EU EPA. So how does it work? Or how does it work to strengthen Japan's position compared with South Korea's position in the bilateral trade negotiation? So 2 items that the US tries to push to Japan are beef and pork. And beef and pork, both products have United States as the biggest importer to Japan. But you know, the beef, the second largest, now actually the largest exporter of beef to Japan is actually Australia. Well, the reason that now Australia exceeds Japan is Australia's beef tariff has decreased thanks to the beginning of the CPTPP. And then that's actually, ironically, that tariff rate was determined by the US pressure in the TPP negotiation. And then now the US beef producers are suffering from that outcome. And pork, the second largest exporter of pork to Japan is Canada, third largest Denmark. So Canada now benefits from the new tariff rate, decreased tariff rate under CPTPP. Denmark enjoys the new tariff rate under Japan EU EPA. So in the negotiation, US has a good reason to be in a hurry to conclude, because otherwise, longer the negotiation goes, the US farmers really will suffer. US-China trade is a very different situation. And so first, what we expect is first that the US will impose the tariff if the negotiation doesn't work. And then China will retaliate. And what will happen? 2 things will happen. If US raises the tariff on, for example, auto parts imported from China to the United States, the companies that are using a lot of auto parts from China are actually the US-based companies, like Ford and GM. Toyota is the company that is using most made in USA parts. So, so in that sense, it will hit directly the US-based auto companies. And then if China raises the tariff, what would happen? Well, the companies that are really complaining about the kind of US-China trade war among the auto companies are BMW and Mercedes. Why then are they complaining? Because they are exporting vehicles from the United States. So Daimler has a very big factory in Alabama, and BMW has a big factory in South Carolina. And actually, BMW closes one of the lines in South Carolina along with the current trade environment. And then they moved that line to Shenyang, China. So, you know, as a result, so point here is economically, it has a negative impact on US producers. So, so that's actually the case. So I don't see anything about like how to strengthen the US position in the negotiation. If US works with allies and then part of the multi-trade agreement and gives a pressure to China for structural reform of the Chinese domestic economy, then that would be probably the most effective way. Although it takes time, but during that time that it takes, U.S. producers will not suffer, but actually will benefit somehow from trade with China.
Yes, Ben.
Thank you so much. I'm really proud of this panel because of 3 of our Mansfield Network for the Future Scholars. They're doing such a great job. I'm Ben Self from the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation. I used to work at the Wilson Center in the 1990s, and when I was here, we had a Wilson Fellow named Keiichi Tsunekawa from University of Tokyo, who's a specialist on Mexico. And he gave a talk. We had a wonderfully well-attended event on Japan and NAFTA as a period when NAFTA was still in prospect and hadn't been through the House yet, through the Congress. But I learned a lot about maquiladora plants and the plan, really the long-term plan for this trilateral economic integration that you've discussed this afternoon. So I'm really delighted to see the fruition and this unusual but really helpful focus on U.S., Japan, and Mexico. I have a question about the future of U.S. and Mexico and the ability to re-envision the economics as a collective, as a common area, sort of the description of a North American auto production, regional auto production, but more broadly economic relationship as an area rather than a national focus. We see in the Trump administration and President Trump himself very much a nationalistic view of this. But Texas is now, as you said, in Texaco, deeply integrated in a cross-border sense with the Mexican economy. And Congressman Joaquin Castro talks about this as well for his districts of San Antonio, the billions of dollars of trade across the U.S.-Mexico border and the tremendous importance that this has for a red state that is Texas. So I'm wondering if we're looking into the future, whether it's another Trump administration or not, whether there's a potential Republican support for a concept of the economic area that's not bounded by the national border, but includes Mexico in this natural economic area that now crosses the border. I realize it's looking into a very vague and unclear future, but can you see any political path towards an arrangement that builds on this U.S., Japan, Mexico economic relationship you've described today? Thank you.
Maybe that actually the future, to speak about future of U.S. and Mexico relation it is very difficult because not only the politics in the United States it's in confusion, but also in Mexico now the regime is changed. The leftist government now is promoted the policies which is very difficult to see the future or the rationality, or so that maybe that actual situation is political factor affects the very important role in decision of policy, so that economic thinking it is not possible. For example, that many people lose their work and the protectionism will be shrink the market. So it's now actually it is very difficult. But the things goes in a very short time, short term and not a long horizon. But economies must be think about investment and the condition, economic condition, the social condition, the political condition must be stable. But many political factors affect the economic functioning. So now that it is very difficult. Now at this point, the situation is very fluid.
If I can jump into that discussion, that's an excellent question, Ben, and going to offer an answer that may come off field. If I were to think of a path forward politically, it would have to do with addressing the democratic deficit in U.S. trade policy. And usually that's described in terms of pharmaceutical companies pressing for excessive copyright and patents and so forth. What I mean when I say that there's a deficit, a democratic deficit in U.S. trade policy, is that if you look at Congress and if you look now at the current White House, what they say about NAFTA or the prospects of North American trade integration is, not positive, is very defensive. It's like we have to have all the production in the homeland and so forth. But that's not how the American public feels. If the latest numbers by the Chicago Global Council on Global Affairs, I think, came out today or yesterday, and support for North America free trade integration, 70 to 80% in both countries. So, and then, the fact that we still have a NAFTA or a USMCA, well, the original NAFTA that President Trump has not pulled the trigger, I think it says a lot. I think he came close a couple of times, according to media reports, but the fact that the integration is already there is so deep. There may be backward steps, and I think Hoshino-san pointed to what the costs are going to be. But nonetheless, the fact that NAFTA survived, but not the U.S. participation in the TPP, speaks to the difference that it makes to have had 25 years of de facto integration on the ground. And, when I was writing the book, 2 years ago, NAFTA was still the punching bag. It was all things were committed by NAFTA. And what we saw when the agreement was about to die is that many groups sprinted, mobilized, and they began to talk about actual benefits. And when you're about to lose something, it turns out that you value it quite a bit. So I think that has changed somewhat the narrative. The problem is, of course, that what the public feels, and certainly what the base of the Democratic Party feels, does not get translated into at the level of the congressional politics, and certainly not with this White House. So that's a democratic deficit that I would like to see addressed.
Let's take one last question. Yes, sir. Hold on.
Richard Coleman. I retired from Customs and Border Protection. I was there for 45 years. When I started, I remember all the whining about Washington state apples that Japan said were not meeting the health standards or whatever. Protectionism is not really typical of the American tariff system. We let cars in from everywhere for 2.5% or less. I don't think there was a country on the planet that would have allowed that. But when NAFTA first came up, I think it passed by 3 or 4 votes. It was as contentious then as trade always is. But we have a president now who thinks that China will pay the tariffs that he imposes. He keeps reinforcing that idea. We're going to take money out of the Chinese pockets by our tariffs, not understanding that American consumers who buy foreign goods, at least half of what's in our marketplace comes from somewhere else. As you say, nobody's complaining at Costco, that the prices are too low. But my question is, with the original NAFTA, a legitimate concern was the dispute resolution procedure, which seemed to supersede any American laws, actually took precedent over American environmental and labor laws and whatever. And I think there was a triumvirate. There were 3 people. Somehow it was always a little bit cloaked in mystery about how that was done. None of those disputes apparently went against the U.S. in a way that, forced the media to explain the process. But that was a legitimate issue. At what point do you give up your sovereignty in the name of an international trade agreement? What's the dispute resolution for the so-called new NAFTA, which I understand isn't really terribly different from the old NAFTA?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. That would take a little while to peel the many layers to the onion. Basically, this is an administration that does not want to push for a very strong dispute settlement mechanism that would constrain its own actions. So there was an opportunity to fix some of the problems with NAFTA. The state-to-state dispute mechanism has largely been inoperative because the Americans have, in many ways, slow-walked the appointment of members to the panel that hears these disputes, and there was an opportunity. Mexico and Canada had ideas to how we break this logjam, but the Americans were not willing to take it, so it remained unfixed. On the investor-state dispute settlement, which is what your question was addressing, that's the ability of investors to seek some redress if the treaty has been violated. They cannot ask for any change in law. That's so it doesn't really violate sovereignty. What they can ask is for monetary compensation if their rights have been expropriated as a result of government action. And the Lighthouse USTR agreed with Canada that for US-Canada disputes that will not be operative, and they also restricted the range of disputes by economic sectors where there can be such a procedure taking place between Mexico and the other parties. So there was an effort to weaken the operation of ISDS, but I think that ISDS is problematic but can be fixed. And bottom line is that investors do not get to write domestic laws or rewrite them.
Okay. We have now come to the end of our session. I would like to thank you for joining us, but if you could also join me in thanking our panelists today.